Our friend and board member Susie Fishman Armstrong is going to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. Susie, take it away.
You got it. Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a good session. Today has been amazing, but of course, I'm a collections geek. Today, I'm happy to introduce John Simmons. John has been committed to the education of museum professionals for more than 25 years. John has a BA in systematics and ecology with an MA in museum studies. He began his career as zookeeper at Fort Worth Zoological Park before becoming collection manager at the California Academy of Sciences and later at the Natural History Museum at the University of Kansas, and that's where I met him, where he also served as director of the Museum Studies program until 2007. John has contributed greatly to museum collections management through his active participation in the field, numerous collection-related publications, many years as a MAP2 site assessor, his hours of service to collections professional organizations, including but not limited to Spinach, ARTS, AAM, CSAAM, formerly known as RCAAM, and MPMA. He is currently editing the 6th edition of the Museum Register Methods, MRM6, with Tony Kaiser. John is the recipient of multiple awards, including but not limited to the Carolyn L. Rose Award for Outstanding Commitment to Natural History Collections and Management from the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections in 2011, and the Dudley Wilkinson Award of Distinction from the Registers Committee of the AAM in 2016, which is the highest award given to through the RCAAM. John currently runs Museologica, a museum consulting service, teaches museum studies for the Universidad Nacional de Colombia and Museum Studies, LLC, and serves as associate curator of collections at the Earth and Mineral Science Museum and Art Gallery at Penn State University. When I reached out to John to ask if he would be willing to speak at MPMA, he quickly jumped to the chance and responded that he has many fond memories of MPMA meetings and has greatly missed being in our region. With that, I would like to welcome John back to MPMA for today and turn it over to him.
All right, thank you very much. So let me get the screen working here. If we can manage to make this work again. So, okay, is that working, Susie? We've got the right screen up?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So thank you all, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the collections care profession. It is a great pleasure to be able to participate in the Mountain Plains Museums Association meeting again, even if it's only virtual. And as people were coming into the room, I saw lots and lots of very familiar names, way too many to call everybody out singly, but hello to everyone. I've greatly missed MPMA since I moved to Pennsylvania. So I'm going to talk to you today about the past and future of collections care. And a few years ago, I decided to write a book on the history of museums with the idea of doing a critical examination of museums from the point of view of collections. I was particularly interested in how and why objects were collected, the transition of an object from its original context to become part of a museum collection, and what the content and organization of collections can tell us about the human beings who assemble the collections. But it became clear pretty early in the research for the book that collection care workers, the registrars, collections managers, and others who take care of collections were almost invisible in the history of museums. And this is particularly disconcerting because museums could not exist without collections, and collections, of course, could not exist without the people to take care of them. So, as Harvard scientist Ernst Mayr once wrote, most problems are far better understood by studying their history than their logic. And so in that sense, I'm going to briefly review the history of collections care and collection care workers with the hopes that we can then better understand the present state of the field and where it might be headed in the future. So to begin with, it's important to remember that collections are much older than museums. Collecting of objects begins sometime in the prehistory in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Collecting seems to be universal among human beings. All cultures collect things because as human beings, we use objects to navigate our way through the world. We also know from archaeological evidence that collecting began with our human ancestors before Homo sapiens had evolved to walk around on the earth. There is substantial amount of evidence of collecting by pre-Homo sapiens human relatives. Much later, after writing was invented, which happened around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, people began to make lists occasionally of what was in the collections, and these kind of give us a tantalizing glimpse of some of the treasures that ancient collections contain. But throughout this history of collecting, what we see are that the available preservative technology, and by that I mean the methods and materials used to preserve objects, determined what could be kept in collections, while the desire to collect certain objects in turns drove the development of better preservation technology to preserve other objects. So we have kind of a do loop going there. We have a few examples of collection care from the very distant past. For one thing, collections care was object-based, which means it was focused on keeping individual objects clean and avoiding their deterioration. The oldest pest control chemical that we know of is sulfur, which was used at least 4,500 years ago by the Sumerians to protect objects from insect damage. The Egyptians used cedar oil and dried chrysanthemum flowers, which of course contain pyrethrins, to protect mummies from pests. There are several plants that produce natural pest repellents that are mentioned in the Rig Veda, the sacred Vedic Sanskrit writings from India. According to the historian Pausanias, in the temples of ancient Greece, bronze shields were coated with pitch to prevent their corrosion. And he also reported that large vats of oil were placed at the feet of the gold and ivory sculpture of Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon to protect it from deterioration in the dry atmosphere in Athens. And we have a record that in the 5th century, the Royal Chinese Archives, which at that time consisted of paper scrolls that were kept in leather boxes, were taken out each month and camphor was added in to preserve those manuscripts. So we have a little bit of information there. The direct precursors of modern museums are the cabinets of curiosities of the Renaissance. And the objects in these cabinets were organized and cared for, but we don't know very much about how they were cared for or by whom. The collectors were limited by available preservation technology, which meant that only objects that could be dehydrated could be preserved. But there are a few clues to how collections were taken care of in some of the illustrations of these cabinets. So this is a woodcut from 1599. And it shows Ferrante Imperato of Naples, who was an apothecary, giving a tour of his private collection. Imperato is the guy with the pointer who's indicating the objects that are hanging off of the ceiling. The visitors are, of course, very well-dressed, wealthy gentlemen. And we can see that the collection was taken care of, and we can see that a lot of energy went into making a good aesthetic arrangement of the collection for viewing. But what we don't see in this woodcut are any of the assistants who worked for Imperato. We know he didn't do it all himself, so where are the assistants? Apparently, they were not worth depicting, although I might note that the 2 little dogs are included in the woodcut. This is an illustration from the title page of a book about the collection of Basilius Besler, who lived in Nuremberg. And this print comes was published in 1616. Besler is on the left, and he's also pointing out something to a visitor. We can see at least one improvement in collection care in this image. It's the first image of a cabinet of curiosities in which some of the storage containers have labels. And there's also a young assistant, and he's shown fetching a skull for Besler to show off to his visitors. This is the cabinet of Fernando Cospi from Bologna. The image was published in 1677. Cospi is shown at the far right, along with a person who served both as the caretaker of the collection and a guide to the museum, named Sebastiano Biavati. You'll note that Biavati is holding the pointer that's used to indicate objects for visitors, and he's also holding an Egyptian sculpture, which was a very important artifact in Cospi's collection. Biavati and his sister Angelica were both dwarves, and they were both well known in society in Bologna and were both educated by Cospi. He paid for their education. Sebastiano was widely respected for his extensive knowledge of the collection. He was famous for the tours he gave, and he also had the ability to speak several languages so he could entertain visitors. We have only one other known image of Bastiani, and this occurs in a fresco in the Basilica of San Petronio, and it's also in Bologna. This is the collection of Levin Vincent's Cabinet of Curiosities, and this illustration also comes from the catalog. And this is for a little later. This is from 1706. You'll note the visitors are all very well dressed, indicating high social status, but the assistant is wearing much less elegant clothing. The assistant is the young boy in the lower right-hand corner, and he is seen helping visitors find the objects they wish to see. Another interesting thing to note about this illustration, in addition to the way the collection is arranged, is that there are some foreign visitors, and these are the people wearing the robes and the turbans over on the left-hand side. But despite all this, we have no indication of how collections care took place in this collection. We have these images because by the end of the Renaissance, the catalog of the Cabinets of Curiosities had become very important documents. Like catalogs in our modern museums, the catalogs of the cabinets were the product of diligent research. And the way the objects were ordered and described in the catalogs can often tell us a lot about the objects and how they were understood and what their place was considered to be in the world. Frequently, the collection catalogs were written by someone other than the owner of the collection. For example, John Tradescant the Younger of London hired a lawyer and antiquarian named Elias Ashmole to write the catalog of his collection. Ashmole had done other collection catalogs as well. The catalog was published under the name Museum Tradescantium. Unfortunately for Tradescant, after his death, through a series of somewhat questionable legal maneuvers, Ashmole managed to wrest control of the collection from the widow, Hester Pooks Tradescant. And once he had ownership of it, he then donated the collection to Oxford University, where it was renamed as the Ashmolean Museum, which it is still known as today, but it's actually is the Tradescant collection. The catalogs were useful for another way in that they enable us to identify a lot of objects from the Cabinets of Curiosities that are still extant. And so in this case, there are two of these objects. One is a deer skin that was decorated with shells that belonged to an Indian who was known to the Europeans as Chief Powhatan and was brought back to the Tradescant collection in the early 1600s. The other is a lantern that was used by Guy Fawkes and was in his possession when he was caught in the basement of the Parliament building. So these were part of the original Tradescant collection. The first comprehensive book to address the acquisition and organization of collections appeared fairly early in museum history in 1565. And this was written by Samuel von Keechberg, who was a librarian to the Duke of Bavaria. And the book was called Inscriptions Are Titles of the Most Ample Theater. Keechberg described an ideal museum in which collections were divided into categories, and his categories were things such as material that glorified the founder of the collection, handicrafts, natural history, technical and ethnographic objects, paintings, things like that. He said that a museum should have a library for research on the collection, a shop, and a pharmacy. And this latter is because most of the plant and animal specimens in the collections were presumed to have some sort of medicinal value. However, Keechberg said almost nothing about the care of the objects in the collections. We have to wait a little later for that. To sum up this era, at the end of the Renaissance, collections care was restricted by the limits of preservation technology. Collection care was based on the care of individual objects. The only objects that could be preserved were those that could be dehydrated or kept dry. It was considered very important to keep the objects clean and try to avoid pests, but that was about as far as collections care went. There were no trained collections care personnel at this time. This was not a profession that anyone could follow. The modern museum is the product of the Enlightenment, and this is a period that was marked by aggressive imperial expansion by the European powers, which brought previously unknown cultural objects, plants, and animals to Europe for exhibition. The Enlightenment is what gave us empiricism and experimentation as a way to gain knowledge of the world, and it's, of course, sparked the scientific revolution along with the advent of inductive reasoning and the institutionalization of knowledge. So it was a period of time when a lot was happening, a really fascinating period. The number of museums grew quite a bit during the Enlightenment. So in 1727, an object dealer in Hamburg named Caspar Friedrich Jenikel published a book called Museographica, or Guide to the Correct Concept and Useful Application of the Museum or Chamber of Rarities. And he published this under the pen name Caspar Nicalius. I don't know why he used the pen name, but he did. This was the first comprehensive museological work to provide advice concerning acquisitions, classification problems, and to address collections care. Nicalia suggested putting a table in the center of the room where things could be brought from the repository to be studied, and this would minimize handling and therefore accidents with things. He recommended that museum objects be stored in dry conditions and kept out of direct sunlight. And he also said that museums should have both an accession book and a catalog. His book was also the first one to discuss the differences in how objects could be seen if they were exhibited in a rectangular hall with south-facing windows rather than in a small square room. So a lot of interesting stuff in his book. The 1800s were a time of enormous growth in museums, but collections care was still object-based. Along with this museum growth came several advances in collection care, however. One of them was the perfection of the art of taxidermy, which had originated in the 1600s, but really came into its own in the 1800s. Along with this came the use of heavy metals as pesticides, particularly arsenic and mercuric chloride, and these became widespread in museums at that time. Indoor lighting was greatly improved by the use of natural gas light, and the old gas lighting fixtures from this era are still hanging from the ceiling of the Oxford Natural History Museum in Oxford, England. This was also the era when thin plate glass was developed that could be used to enclose exhibit cases to help keep objects clean. However, there were still a lot of limitations to preservation technology. In the 1840s, William Swainson compared the storerooms of the British Museum with the catacombs of Palermo, and he said each of these was apparently opened once a year to determine how much decay had occurred and to deposit fresh material, which is not really a very good description of good collections care. In the year 1900, there were still essentially no collections care professionals. Most museums were staffed by a director who was a subject matter authority, and then some poorly paid and very poorly trained assistants. The field of museology did not exist yet, which meant that museum work was all practice. There was no theory to apply to it. However, beginning about 1900, we find a few enlightened museum directors who begin to hire staff with professional training and make changes. Notable among these in the United States was John Cotton Dana of the Newark Museum. He made a number of brilliant hires. One of them was Louise Connolly. He hired Louise Connolly in 1912 as the first official museum educator. She was a feminist and a suffragette, really interesting person. She trained the first class of professional museum educators in a course taught at the Newark Museum. And she must have been a very interesting person with a good sense of humor. One year, she traveled by train around the United States to assess museum education programs, and she was accompanied by a stuffed squirrel named Mr. Frisky on her trip. It was around this time that the first professional organizations for museum and professionals were founded. The oldest of these is the Museums Association of the UK, which is still in existence. It was founded in 1889. The American Association of Museums, which is of course now the American Alliance of Museums, started in 1906, but the first real international organization, the Museum Division of UNESCO, didn't come around until 1946, much later. Around right after 1900, we begin to find our first professional training. The first formal training program for museum professionals in the United States was a 2-year program started in 1908 by Sarah York Stevenson. Very unusual for the time, her classes included the teaching of both theory and practice. Stevenson was fascinating. She was born in Paris, raised in Mexico. She was an archaeologist, an Egyptologist, was one of the founders of the Penn Museum at University of Pennsylvania. And so she had quite a bit of influence. A few other programs followed after her at other institutions, but only a very few. And it was really not until the 1970s that postgraduate museum studies training in the United States became widely available. Rebecca Buck has traced the use of the title registrar in museums back to 1881. It's an old word, it just means someone who keeps a register. So it's been around for hundreds of years. But in 1881, Stephen C. Brown was hired at the Smithsonian Institution under the title registrar. Around 1905, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York hired a registrar, followed by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 1906. So these are the first appearances of a formal name applied to someone doing collections care. It's important to note that many of the fundamentals of museum registration were derived from the library profession, particularly the work of Melville Dewey, who is best known for inventing the Dewey Decimal System, but also Henry Watson Kent of the Metropolitan Museum of New York Library. In his book on the history of museology, Jesus Lorente identified 3 components that were fundamental in establishing professional practice in museums: formal training programs, professional associations, and specialized publications about museums. So these 3 components enable the establishment of the collections care profession. Rebecca Buck has dug around and also found one of the earliest known job descriptions of a registrar. This one comes from 1907. So you'll note the duties. The registrar is supposed to receive objects that come into the museum, put a number and on the objects and accession them, place the objects in the room for recent accessions, and attach a label to them. There's really nothing about collections care in that job description, nothing about collections and storage environments, keeping things clean, any of that. At the time, registrars were mostly concerned with documentation, not with collections care. Well, this brings us to specialized publications, because arguably the single most important development in collections care as a profession was the publication of museum registration methods in 1958. The idea for the book came from a registrar session at the AAM meeting in Indianapolis in 1952. The 2 people who stepped forward to take on the task when it was suggested that a book be published were Dorothy Dudley and Irma Wilkinson. Dorothy Dudley was a graduate of Wheaton College. She went to work for the Newark Museum in 1925 for a salary of $50 a month, if you can imagine that, and then moved to the Museum of Modern Art as a registrar in 1936. Irma Wilkinson graduated from University of Wisconsin in 1929 and joined the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a registrar in 1930. In addition to being a registrar, she was also a widely recognized authority on Middle Eastern and Islamic art. When they prepared the first edition of Museum Registration Methods, which they thought would be the only edition, Dudley and Wilkinson were both already experienced registrars. Dudley was 52 and Dudley was 55 rather, and Wilkinson was 52. And this experience, I think, is why the book was so successful. They had already dealt with these issues quite a bit. They emphasized in the introduction to the first edition of the book that cooperative labor and support produced this manual. And with that very simple statement, Dudley and Wilkinson set a tone for the profession that endures today. Registrars and collection managers are still an amazingly collaborative, supportive, and friendly professional community to be in. The book proved to be enormously successful and quickly sold out, so an updated edition, second edition, was prepared in 1968, followed by a 3rd edition in 1979, which happens to be the edition I used in graduate school. By then, museum registration methods had grown. The first edition was only 225 pages. This one was 437, and the page size was much larger. So the book continued to be important. There was a major change in format and the content with the 4th edition, which came out in 1998. And it also had 2 new editors, Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore. The 4th edition was appropriately entitled The New Museum Registration Methods because of the changes they made to the book. And so these changes in format and content reflected the growing sophistication and complexity of the role of the registrar. Rebecca and Jean went on to produce an enlarged 5th edition, affectionately known as MRM5 in 2010, which by now is up to 516 pages. And the newest edition, MRM6, came out in the spring of 2020, the spring of this year. And it retains the basic structure of MRM5, but has either all new or revised chapters. And it's nearly 600 pages long and also has 2 new editors. So we need to go back in time a little bit to keep our timeline and story here in chronological order, back to the 1960s. At this time, a movement started in France advocating a critical examination of museums. And this was really important because it had an effect on museums worldwide. The movement resulted in the publication of a very influential book in English in 1989 that's still around and still worth reading, called The New Museology. This critical examination of museums led to the call for museums that were more inclusive, accessible, and socially aware. And this critical examination is still ongoing. The current emphasis on decolonization in museums is a direct result of this critical examination and how it's being applied. Among many important changes that this critical examination of museums brought about was the integration of theory into academic museum studies, which made a major change in how we approached museum studies. And it also, this movement also broadened the concept of what museums could be. Traditionally, a museum was considered to be a building with collections, and the public came in to look at them. But this movement said, well, museums could be more than that. They could be territory, patrimony, and community, which is pretty much the definition of an eco-museum. So it had a lot of effects that resounded worldwide, including here in the US. The 1970s became a time of great change in museums in the United States, in large part because of this movement started in France. There were also many changes in the collections care profession, particularly in how registrars were trained and how museums were evaluated. This began with the publication in the United States of America's Museums, the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was issued in 1964 under the government of Lyndon Johnson by the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities. This was the first comprehensive report to review the functions, conditions, staffing, and the strained financial situation of museums in the US. And as a result of the Belmont Report, more federal money began to be made available to museums, and this is what spurred the American Alliance of Museums to start its accreditation program, which provided the first professional standards that museums could strive for. And as Rebecca Buck put it in one of her publications, the process of accreditation accelerated everything professional in museums, including creation of more positions for collection managers, collection technicians, exhibit managers, registrars, and curators. The introduction of preventive conservation came along about this same time, and this came along because of improvements in our understanding of how objects respond to changes in the storage environment and how materials age, and it has resulted in major changes and significant improvements in the care of collections. Environmental standards got started with the publication of the 2 editions of Gary Thompson's groundbreaking book, The Museum Environment, the newest edition being 1986. The idea behind preventive conservation is that we can prolong the useful life of objects in collections by controlling the agents of deterioration and maintaining a collection in a stable storage environment. Thanks to extensive research, the formerly strict environmental set points of the early 1970s and 80s have been replaced by more flexible ranges that take into account local climates and the capacity of your building to maintain a steady, seasonally adjusted storage environment with minimal fluctuations. The latest word on storage environments is this publication from 2019 called Preventive Conservation Collection Storage. It was sponsored by several organizations, including the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, the American Institute of Conservation, the Smithsonian, and George Washington University. This combination of contributors is a very good indication of how integrative collections care became or has become at this point in time. So backing up again a little bit, the title collections manager came into use in the mid-1970s, first in natural history museums and then in other types of museums. A 1990 survey revealed that the tasks of collections managers included the registration and collection care responsibilities that had traditionally been assigned to registrars, but had a greater emphasis on hands-on collections care as well as electronic collection management systems, which were just coming into vogue in museums. Although there were some attempts to distinguish between a registrar and a collection manager, the responsibilities of the 2 positions very quickly converged, and the job titles are now, for all practical purposes, synonymous. This brings us to computers in museums. The first serious attempt at developing a computer program for managing museum collections was in 1965 at the University of Oklahoma. The Museum Computer Network was formed in 1967. Even though that attempt at 1965 was a dismal failure, a group got together in New York and formed the Museum Computer Network to promote the use of computers in museums, because it was clear that this would work if with a little more energy. By the 1980s, we find dozens of database programs in use in museums, and in large part that has to do with the development of transistors and personal computers. The increased emphasis on electronic collection management systems in museums since the 1980s has resulted in some interesting socio-technical interactions as human beings, technology, and information have all intersected. Collections management is now a rather delicate balance between caring for the objects, making them objects available for use, and managing the electronic collection information system in the museum. Unfortunately, the design of collection management systems has been driven up until this point by the users of collection data rather than by those in charge of collections care. As a result, the systems we have manage data very well, but they do not help us manage the collection objects at all. The most pressing problem at present is that there is no way to preserve electronic information into the future. Museums have invested millions of dollars in creating electronic records, but reformatting this information continually without loss of data is going to cost millions and millions more, and museums simply cannot afford this. Within 20 years, no one will be able to read the electronic records you were creating today unless they are continually reformatted. The current emphasis on digitization has only exacerbated this because we are rapidly creating more and more digital files which will not be readable even in the near future without substantial work. The first organization for collections care professionals in the United States was the Registrar's Committee of the American Association of Museums. It was founded in 1977, so fairly late in the game. The RCAAM quickly became a driving force in the profession. It produced a variety of workshops, publications, and best practice standards. The name of this organization was changed to the Collection Stewardship Professional Network in 2017. As collection care workers became more numerous and specialized, several other professional associations were founded, such as the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, which started in 1985. The largest professional organization for collections professionals is ARCS, the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists, which was founded just in 2012. So collections care is now based on preventive conservation. This means that the main emphasis is on collection storage and the exhibition environment, because this affects all of the objects in the museum. So rather than being object-based, it is now collection-based, environment-based. Electronic collection management systems have greatly enhanced collection management, but they also take time away from hands-on collection care. Collections care professionals must constantly learn new information to do their jobs well, but we also can now make the argument without a problem that good collections care is fundamental to the success of all other aspects of museums. A few years ago, my friend Sally Shelton, who is now the Associate Chair of the Heritage and Museum Science Program at Texas Tech, reviewed 50 years of murder mysteries and science fiction films that were set in museums to see how museum staff were depicted. Among the things she discovered were that curators were far and away the most likely to be murdered, while directors and trustees were most likely to be the murderers, which is interesting. Somewhat more disturbing, though, is that the museums seem to have only one other category of employee, and that's museum guards, who seem to always get murdered. So this raises a very interesting question. Where are the collections care workers? Where are the registrars and the collections managers? So Sally's study was mostly for fun, and it was not quite quantitative, but it was pretty thorough. But it draws attention to something that is central to the current debate about inclusion and diversity in our profession. And this is that the public does not know that anyone works in museums other than directors, curators, and guards. If the public is unaware of us, how do we ever hope to attract a more diverse and talented young people into the profession? What we need to do, and this is very important, is find ways to let students know about the profession before they get to college so that people know we exist. Which brings us to the future. What will happen to collections care in the future? Well, prognostication is always perilous, but there are a few predictions that I think it's safe to make based on my 50 years of professional experience in museums, and as well as reviewing literature and taking a look at current trends. One of these is that museums are going to continue to evolve, as they have always evolved, as new ways are found to use the objects in the collections and the information associated with the collections, and new ways that those objects can be presented to the public. Museum growth in the United States and Canada and Europe will continue to slow down as it is now, but museum growth is going to greatly increase in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And museums in these regions are going to evolve in ways that are increasingly different from the museums we know today. This is already happening to a large degree. It will happen to an even greater degree in the future. Overall, in all places, museums are going to be larger, the objects in the collections older, and they're going to be cared for by fewer and fewer people, which means we need to change the way we manage collections in many ways. So what do we need to do to make sure that the collections care profession itself has a future? Well, one of the big things is diversify the collections care workforce, which means making people aware that we exist. We also need to pay collections care workers a wage that reflects their knowledge, training, experience, expertise, and the complexity of the work they do. And I'm sure this audience will all agree with this one. We need to do a better job of accessioning to control collection growth and to keep the collections focused on serving the institutional mission. We need to find cost-effective ways to preserve electronic information for the long-term future, because right now we do not have any. All means of preserving electronic information involve plastics and pieces of metal, neither of which is a long-term material. Because museums are going to have larger, more complex and older collections, but fewer staff, we have to find more efficient, cost-effective ways to manage collections. For example, we need to rethink storage furniture, redesign it so that it provides more protection from the agents of deterioration while making better use of space, and also making it easier to monitor the condition of individual objects stored in the storage furniture. Electronic collection management systems are still inadequate for managing collections. We need a new generation of collection management systems that integrate traditional registration information with data on object use and movement, environmental monitoring, deterioration of materials, integrated pest management, preventive conservation, all of these things to provide a truly useful collection management tool. And although far more information on collection care is available, both in print and online, than it ever was before, unfortunately, so is far more misinformation, which means that collections care workers have to increasingly have good critical thinking skills to separate the wheat from the chaff. So there's a lot I've left out of this story in order to fit it into the time that we're allotted today, but I want to leave you with a few thoughts. The first is, we must never forget that what makes museums unique is that they are the only institutions that combine objects with learning. Museums use objects to help people understand the world that they live in. As my friend Christopher Norris has pointed out, museums are the closest thing we have to time machines, because by using the objects in the collections, we can travel back in time to see why things are the way they are now, and we can move forward in time to glimpse what they might become. These things are critically important, but they can only happen if the objects in museum collections are properly registered, documented, and cared for. So at this point, I'll be happy to take questions. If anyone has questions that they don't have time to get in, or has thoughts or would like to disagree with me, I'm happy to hear that too. And so here's my email address, and feel free to contact me. So at this, I'll quit sharing the screen and turn it back over to our hosts, and be happy to take collections from you.
Does anybody have any questions? And I guess while people are coming up with questions, kind of throwing this out, this is where I'm coming from, and this is where I really geek out. I can't help it. The fact that our profession started officially in the 1970s, and that's the generation I was born in, we right now, every one of us on here, because it's such a new profession, is defining what we're going to look like in the future. Unlike other professions that have been here for a long time, specifically with collections management, we're new enough and things are changing fast enough that we're making the rules. And I think that is awesome and powerful.
That it is. I believe Peggy had her hand up. No?
I was clapping, John.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to hit me with a question.
Other questions, folks? You caught us at the end of 3 days worth of Zoom calls, John.
I was going to say, it must be a day of Zoom calls.
Stretch a little and get our juices up.
Mark Jansen has something. He says,
please.
no disagreement here. How do you feel about the new ICOM definition conversation regarding this issue?
It's a conversation. Yeah, it is very interesting because this reflects an international disagreement with what museums are. In part, that definition comes out of that French group that started in the 1960s looking at museums. In part, it comes out of the fact that the museum growth in Asia, Africa, and Latin America has been tremendous, but because most of the publications do not appear in English, they are basically unknown to us in the United States, where museums are far more active socially, particularly museums of memory. But it also comes up from the point of what is the purpose of a museum definition. I had a chance to talk about this with my colleagues in Colombia when I was there teaching in Bogota in March, and their concern was that is not a definition they can take to their government to say this is what a museum is. And that is a major problem. They agreed in principle with the ideas that museums could do those things, but they did not like it as a definition. So I think, and I did not go to the ICOM meeting. My friend Kirsten Latham was there, and apparently it was quite a circus in Kyoto when that was discussed. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. I happen to think the old ICOM definition is pretty good. And I could see maybe some tweaks here and there, but I think the new definition is more of a what is a museum mission than it is a definition of museum, but I'm happy to entertain opposing thoughts on that.
I'd just like to add a little to that. We had a big discussion in my museum management class with my students about the definitions, and what was interesting is they were saying that they thought the new definition was more of a, what would we like museums to be? Like how would we like museums to strive for? What should they strive to be like? But not a definition of what a museum is. So
more aspirational than functional.
Right, more aspirational for sure. And I think it's interesting you mentioned Colombia because an article I had them read was about the Museum of Memory in Medellin. Mm-hmm. And how that really kind of does fit that new definition more, but maybe, like you said, different museums in different parts of the world may have more of that definition. Yeah,
there's also a Museum of Memory in Bogota, and those are both, of course, devoted to the long 40-plus year war that they have had with the guerrilla forces. And there's quite a bit of the one in Medellin was developed with a lot more input from people working in museums in Colombia. The one in Bogota is a little more controversial because it was developed by well-meaning people, but they didn't bother to consult with their own colleagues about what a museum should be. But this is an example of a more socially aware institution it's kind of a throwback to the 1800s when a lot of the colonial museums as colonial areas became independent. They took their national museums, which had been founded by their colonial overlords, and turned them into their new ways to define themselves. There's a really good article about the Mexican Museum of Anthropology based on that, and then a few others, one in the Barbados, some other places. And I think it's kind of like that. They're turning the museum into a place that can help define a better society. But I don't think it works real well as a definition. I'm not against socially aware museums or museums that have a purpose like that. It's just that as an ICOM definition, I think it presents a lot of issues. Other comments or questions?
In the chat, Brian Winery says, anyone else want to bring back terms like Chamber of Rarities, or is it just Brian?
Oh, I love that term. Chamber of, Cabinets of Curiosities, Chamber of Rarities. I think those are still, people go to museums because they want to see real things, and they usually want to see unusual things. Back when creating your own website became a thing to do in museums, a lot of people were scared that if they put their exhibits, their museum on the web, no one would come because they just look at it on their computer and they'd be happy and stay home. And of course, the reverse happened. Putting images of objects you have on exhibit on the internet made people want to come see the object in person, because those objects speak to us as human beings. We really want to see those objects. I had an experience a couple of years ago. I was doing a national park training program. So we were there for a few days at the regional center for the Washington, D.C. area, and, putting people through their paces and all this training. And at the very end, the manager of the training center ask us as the instructors, we had a little time left at the end of the day, would you like a tour of our collections? So of course we said yes. So we went back, and this is an amazing place. They have a freezer full of nitrate film. They have box after box after box of stuff left at the Vietnam Memorial, including a Harley Davidson motorcycle. So they box up the stuff once a week and bring it out. Nothing's being done with it yet, but there's a lot of research potential there. Then he said, let me show you our real treasure, the thing that gets to everybody. So it took 4 people to move out this huge flat gray box, opened it up, and there was an overcoat, a long black overcoat with the narrowest shoulders I've ever seen on a man's overcoat. And it had a tag. It was made by Brooks Brothers for Abraham Lincoln. He had it draped over his chair at the Ford Theater, and his blood stains were on the collar. And parts of the coat, on the lower part of the coat, had been cut away and given as souvenirs by his valet, which was fairly common practice at the time. But seeing Abraham Lincoln's bloodstains on that overcoat just hit all of us really hard. And we were hardened museum professionals. We see this stuff all the time, but we were all just speechless, just being that close to an object. And I think that is the way it affects everybody. Doesn't matter if you're a grizzled old museum professional or if you're a little 5-year-old kid. It's still, seeing those objects is so cool. So yeah, I like Chamber of Rarities.
Lauren Hunley has a question. She says, what kind of long-term effects do you see the current COVID-19 crisis having on museum collections?
I keep reading articles that such and such, throw in whatever you want, restaurants, museums, gas stations will never be the same. I don't agree. You look back at the Spanish flu, we returned to our usual stupid selves pretty quick. And I think we will, as Americans, return to our usual stupid selves pretty quick after COVID. The problem is going to be whether we lose some institutions and how soon we can get back to returning. But I really don't see, maybe it's because I'm old, I really don't see major changes sticking. I would like to see some things change. I would like to see us use the internet a lot more, because by doing this, we can make more information available. I would like to see conferences have even if they're an in-person conference, have a web component. I would like to see museums worry a lot more about who's in their audience and who's coming, but I don't know that it's gonna have any real long-term effects. I would almost bet you that within 3 years, we're pretty well back to normal, with the exception of those unfortunate institutions that didn't make it through this crisis.
Heather Kaufman says something about caring for digital,
Yeah,
born digital items. Yeah, say, ask your question.
Yeah, it was like a thought I had, and I wanted to put it in the chat. But like when you were talking about like the technology, like, even on the collections care side, I mean, I had an interview once and they were like, how are you going to care for robots? And I was like, don't know.
Well, it's a good
But
robot. It
so
should take care
like,
of itself.
because like you have like the physical age of the robot, but they still want it to be, usable, and you have to store like that computer component. And then there's always questions on the listserv about like born digital, and it's just like,
This is a
yeah.
huge problem. There is a chapter in the new museum registration methods on born digital collections, and a greatly enhanced chapter on taking care of on computers in museums. But this business of saving the data is the real crux of the problem. With born digital, we can save the equipment that the digital art object was produced on, which a lot of museums have done. We can't guarantee that it's going to work. We're not going to have old software that can run on new machines, so that's a big problem. But the actual saving of the physical file, not physical files, but the digital files is the biggest problem. Because right now, our only way to do that is to reformat it, which is expensive, and almost every reformatting takes away some data. So you have some information loss. And if you project that out, we can pick up the catalog of the Tradescant collection and read it. We can do that with collections from the Renaissance, but in 600 years, can we read anything that's going to be electronic? Well, without a major expense. So I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is a serious, serious problem. And I like to tell my students, at my age, it's not my problem, it's yours. Solve it. But that is true. It is going to take a new generation of museum professionals coming in with a much better understanding of electronic information, of what's important to save. Is it important to save the machine that ran the robot or the machine that produced the digital art, or is it important to save the file, or is it important to save a representation? And so I think people that have a better familiarity with these materials, which means anyone younger than me, is going to make that decision a lot better. So I think we will find ways, but it is a serious problem. And I would love to see a conference dedicated to that so we could start kicking ideas around, thinking things through and discussing them. Because right now it's a paper here, a blog post there, a conversation in the hallway somewhere, but let's get this on the table and talk. That's a pretty serious problem, especially for born digital art. You, Heather, can solve that problem.
We've got some real digital gurus in the room.
That's what we need.
Put the thought piece out there for someone else. We can work on it together.
Yeah, but we really do need that thought pieces.
And yeah, what you were saying about like the robots and stuff like that is really interesting, because like even toys and stuff from the like materials collect like Furbies, Game Boys, those type of things, even though they're, only 20, 30 years old. I don't want to say 30 because I know I'm going to be 30 soon, but even those things, when you find them, like say at a thrift store, there's, they don't function because those things weren't really made to last. And if they end up in a collection, say in another 20 years, they're small electronics. If you try to get them even in a basic working order, you're going to need understanding of electronics and soldering. And my brother is a small electronics major, so even if like a cell phone ended up in a collection, just to get it in working order, you're going to have to know. I mean, this is more on the like restoration and preserving side of things to keep it in a functional order, but
not to mention the plastics, which you're breaking down very rapidly.
The plastics.
No, that's true. These are all problems.
Yeah,
problems to be solved. A conservator once was talking about at a meeting I was at, was talking about preserving modern art, meaning contemporary things made today, and she looked at us. She said, you realize that most of these materials were never intended to be conserved a long time, and now we're trying to do it. She's also the person who pointed out that long after all the silk kimonos in museums have deteriorated, we'll still have leisure suits from the 70s. So she liked to depress people. So somebody had a question I saw in the chat about how do I think collection management systems are lacking? Well, for instance, I would like to be able to pull an object out of the collection and know what temperature and humidity regimes it's been subjected to for the last 20 years, because that'll tell me a lot about how its material is deteriorating. I'd like to know exactly where pests have occurred in the collection storage area over that same period of time. It's that kind of stuff. We are accumulating information, we're not putting it together. I want a single program where I can sit down and know everything about my objects, where they are and what they've been exposed to and how they've been used over their lives, then I can make good management decisions without having to go trying to second guess all of these things.
That's the $1 million idea you just gave somebody right there, John.
I keep trying. I was actually a consultant, a company making a pitch to a federal government agency for a collection database, and I gave them heart and soul on that issue, and they ignored it. They didn't get the contract either. that I'm sure it was for some other reason.
Right.
But no, I think that we're capable of that now. I'm not asking for something that will require, you know, some genius to come up with. I'm asking for something that any decent computer programmer could put together.
That's really interesting. It's like bioinformatics for the inside of the museum.
Right. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really good analogy. Yeah. But we really need that so we can know how to manage these objects. Okay, I can't see all the things in chat, so if there's questions in the chat that should be asked, if somebody could let me know.
You got the last question. Aaron Brown said, knowledge in the various programming languages will become a necessity for collections managers, which kind of came to my mind as you were talking. The types of people that come into the profession have got to diversify in that way as well, right? They've got to also be tech geeks and things like that coming in and realizing that they don't just have to love.
Well, or at least know how to talk to your tech people and to explain what you want. Yeah, I don't know that as a collection manager you necessarily need to know how to program, but you better know how to talk to a programmer. I mean, they don't speak English, they're programmers. So you're going to have to start with little drawings and things. You know what I mean? You're going to have to understand enough about computer systems that you can have a good discussion with them about what you need so they can make it for you.
I have 2 programmers as roommates.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I know, they speak a different language.
Yeah, it's like living on another planet. Yeah.
Just last week, I pulled out my 1981 TI 94A computer and plugged it in. I'm surprised it works, but the joysticks do not. You're right, the plastic's going. And I have every single game with that whole unit, but there's nothing else you can do. I sadly had to throw away Donkey Kong.
No, poor Donkey Kong.
Just make sure you go to the programmer with your gift of a rubber duck.
There you go.
And I think that communication with the programmer is the issue. And really the reason our programs don't do this now is because they have been driven largely by curators and other users of the collection, which is not to say that's bad. That was what they needed. And programmers have not listened to us. We don't write the grants. We're not the ones hiring them. And so they listen to the people that hire them. And we need to get in that conversation. We need to be the ones they talk to. So we've got to waylay these people and say, look, listen, you know, there is something else that's needed. It's great data management, love that part of it, but you need to integrate this other data.
Rachel, you going to solve that for us? She's my resident database expert right now. We were talking about it in a different session today.
Amusingly enough, my undergraduate, 20 years ago, was a double major in history and anthropology and a minor in computer science. But, it was also 20 years ago. Programming languages have changed so much.
Yeah.
Okay, I see a lot of people thought that curators should be murdered. I won't disagree with that, but that's neither here nor there. Let's see. It would be fun to do this Sally's survey again, and I've talked to her about doing it, to go back and look more systematically about representations of museum personnel in the literature. When I wrote a book on fluid preservation, I actually devoted a chapter to fluid preservation and cultural expression, and it gave me an excuse to watch a lot of really bad sci-fi movies to see if they had anything preserved in fluid in them. But it is interesting because, people think of formaldehyde in glass jars, and they don't necessarily think about the actual reasons we're preserving this stuff. But I think it is enlightening. It's fun, but it can tell you a lot about how the field is perceived, to see that who is it working in museums, and directors, curators, and guards. Well,
we hit our hour. I will stay here all day and talk with all of you, as we always discussed. But with respect to John, we slotted him in for an hour. Are there any other questions though? Can we delve into any other areas? We don't want to miss anybody. Don't be shy.
Okay, I see Rachel said she's totally asking Sally about it. Sally has published 2 papers on that. So make her give you copies of them.
Anybody's just welcome to unmute and speak up.
For sure.
And like I say, if you have questions that you think of later that you didn't want to ask in front of the group, or if you'd like to disagree, just drop me an email. Always happy to entertain those.
I just have it's not really a question, it's just an observation. Unfortunately, since I'm connected with the security side of things as well as the collection side of things, when you're talking about who's being represented in the movies, unfortunately, the security folks are always represented as doofuses. And that's really not what we want to have as security people in museums.
Well, it's not fair to them either, because most of them are actually very diligent and do their job really, really well. So yes, it is a very unfair stereotype.
Yeah.
So John, I do have a question. You've been active in ARCS and, RCAAM, and, we have all these regional societies, and I've been asked to kind of look at it through by Sebastian with the CSAAM. If everybody's looking with all these different I guess areas, and people are looking at collections management, one of my things is somebody probably already has the answer that I need, but it's trying to communicate, like keeping together with ARCS and communicating with all the other, any advice or just anything in general. I might go into spinach just so I can learn things that doesn't come out here.
I think stay connected. Watch Museum L, which I think is a good listserv. There's also the one that is still run by the Collection Stewardship, used to be the RCAAM's listserv. There is the forum on ARCS. You have to be a member of ARCS to participate in that, but they get a lot of questions. The Connecting to Collections currently is getting a lot of questions, which get answers. Those are actually monitored. You can't have just anybody weighing in on those. So they have conservators who review those questions and then send them out to the right people to answer, to people that are qualified. So you can get a really good answer out of that group. But I think that, and staying abreast of the literature, keeping an eye on what gets published, and bugging your institutional library to buy the really expensive things and reading the others yourself. I think all that is important. One of the things I've enjoyed most about my museum career is that you never stop learning. There's something new all the time that you've got to go pick up. I would hate to have a job where I knew everything and that was it, I was done. But with museums, it's something new all the time, or some new twist on what you've been doing. I saw a question yesterday that really got to me because I'd never thought about it. The question was on, I believe it was on Museum L, and it was, they had a donor who wanted to make a donation to the museum, but didn't want to sign the deed of gift because they wanted to remain anonymous, which sounds like a problem, right? Well, the donation was Ku Klux Klan memorabilia. Well, that should be in a museum, but you don't blame the person for not wanting to sign that document. So, you see this kind of thing come up, and it really makes you think and work. But that's my advice to students is pay attention to the listservs, keep an eye out for the literature, look and make sure that you know what's happening, what's going on.
One follow-up comment I had, let me see if yeah, Chuck Regier here from Coffin Museum. You were talking about the difficulty of storing, digital data into the future. That's compounded by the fact that it's so easy to generate it now. Things used to be precious, and you only had a few of them, and you took good care of them. But the digital data, we just create gigabytes of it without even thinking.
Yeah. And you would expect someplace like National Archives to have a solution, but they don't either. National Archives began dealing with this problem early because the Clinton White House was the first White House that produced more digital documents than paper. By the time you got to the end of Bush II's term, almost everything important was digital. Very, very little paper material produced. So they're getting dumped with all this stuff, but even they don't have a solution for how to preserve it. But you were quite right. We are generating reams and reams. And you look at the size of digitization files. We're putting a lot of money into digitizing objects and making images that can be used in just a myriad ways. And if we keep those images, they will probably be used in ways we've not even thought of in the future. But how do we keep all that stuff? We're going to have server farms around the world to maintain that data, if we can find a way to keep it currently available to read. So yeah, this is another one. We really need to have a discussion about this.
Well, and related to that too, I think, which we don't think about a lot, is digital data in the cloud has a carbon footprint. And that's, I think, a new thing we'll have to face. And it's interesting working with some younger staff who've grown up with powerful computers and terabytes of storage that they think nothing about, and to try to make the case for keeping your files small. I don't mean like low resolution, but designing them in ways so they don't take up so much space. You feel kind of silly, as if you're an outdated, you know, I'm still living in the era where I remember zip drives and, you know, where a megabyte was worth a lot. But it'll come back to haunt us, I think, if we aren't thinking about how to keep things efficient.
Yeah, I've seen one paper written estimating carbon footprint of digital data storage, and it's very scary.
Yeah.
It is a huge carbon footprint. And beyond that, cloud storage itself raises a big issue, because cloud storage basically means you're storing your information on somebody else's server. And if you look at the rates servers are compromised, why would you want to do that? And when I advise my client museums, I always tell them, do not store your collection data on the cloud, because of that very issue, because the cloud is far more susceptible to someone breaking in through some server, because you don't know whose server it is your data is on. It's out there on somebody's. But
yeah, that's a good point. Even, you know, AOL is gone now, but when we talk about the cloud, we're really talking about a computer somewhere that someday they could go out of business. If Google were to go out of business, and anyone on Google Cloud, which is where even the RC MPMA puts all of their shared documents, we're in trouble.
Yeah, I think you need to really think about that. I see we have a question from Mindy about publications. What's out there that's good? This depends on what part of museums you're interested in. For collections care, there is a pretty good list, a registrar's bookshelf list on the ARC's website that you can get to without being a member. It's available to the public. You have to kind of dig for it. But it lists print publications and some online resources that are pretty much the basic stuff that you need to know. Beyond that, you need to talk to colleagues. We are lucky in one sense in that a Rowman and Littlefield, which used to be the official publisher for AASLH, is kind of taking over that corner of the market. They are now also the official publisher for AAM. And so I have published with them. So there's just so you know, that conflict of interest. But if you look at their catalog, you get a pretty good idea of what's coming out. But you'd also want to check Routledge and a few others. But that's one reason to keep an eye out on the listserv and what's going on the web, is you'll hear about these publications, and you can hear about them from your colleagues, or ask people if they think they're worth reading or not, or read them yourself and make your own decisions. But there's a lot out. When I was getting into a broader aspect of museum studies beyond just taking care of natural history collections back in the 70s, my big frustration was how the paucity of literature. There was just practically nothing out there to read. My big frustration now is there's like way too much out there to read. And so we have gone from rags to riches on this one. It is difficult to keep up. And I look at what comes into our house between Julianne and I. My wife is also works in a museum, and between us, it's like the kitchen table gets filled with books that we have not read very easily, and it's almost frustrating.
Okay, thank you.